Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Office of the Patriot. In this office, I try to make sense out of the nonsense of the progressive left and RINO right. Throughout my career as a peace officer in California, I've seen a steady erosion of the goals, tenets, and ideals of law enforcement over the last 3 decades. And I spoke to this phenomenon in episode 39, the weaponization of law enforcement, and in episode 87, the weaponization of the judicial system by the Democrat Party. I made some predictions and suggestions for fixing some of these problems. However, the last few weeks have revealed that, some of my ideas were, overly optimistic. I now believe that as opposed to introducing an enema into the federal law enforcement arm to get rid of the crap that has corrupted it, it needs to be completely revamped and remade anew. So stick around for this episode of Office of the Patriot, where I will discuss the reasons why and the process for doing just that. Law enforcement, one of the most critical jobs to ensure an orderly and safe society. More than a significant amount of my life was dedicated to this career, and I have no regrets. However, as I said in the introduction, I have seen and even experienced the degradation of law enforcement's primary responsibility as a result of woke ideology and DEI and the deep state Democrat Party. The first part of my career was with the California Department of Corrections, more affectionately known as CDC. Back then, the rehabilitation, or the R, wasn't in the title, as it is now, and you can thank Rhino Schwarzenegger for that. But even before the R, the department had a fair amount of programs and opportunities for inmates to improve their lives. They had substance abuse programs, they had programs for anger issues, and they had programs to improve education and employability. But I guess that wasn't enough, because the goal of the department began changing to a point where rehabilitation and reducing recidivism became the primary goal, as opposed to public safety, which was the primary goal when I started back in 1988. In order for me to really bring home the point that our law enforcement organizations, specifically federal and to a lesser extent state law enforcement, have been at best corrupted, but in reality usurped by the aforementioned deep state, I need to go over a brief history of law enforcement, the resultant federalization, and ultimately the corruption of federal law enforcement departments. For society to flourish, the first thing you need is to know what the rules are and what the repercussions are for breaking those rules. And I know this is kind of an oversimplification of the law, but for the purposes of this presentation, it works well. This idea isn't unique to the United States or to any modern society. In fact, the Babylonian king Hammurabi established one of the first comprehensive codes of conduct in 1792 BC. And this is also known as the Code of Hammurabi. What made this collection of rules of conduct unique was not just the fact that it spelled out what couldn't be done within Babylonian society, but it also noted what the consequences would be for violation of the rules in the form of fines, torture, dismemberment, and even death. Laws here in the United States follow the same basic set of rules. However, here, the rules are tempered by the United States Constitution. So, law enforcement or the courts cannot order someone's hand to be chopped off following a guilty verdict for theft. Although, I sometimes think that that might be an appropriate punishment, but that's just me. The United States Constitution also limits our federal government's involvement in most matters that fall into the realm of law enforcement, especially state and local law enforcement, courtesy of the 10th Amendment. But the federal government gets around this roadblock because Congress controls the purse strings of the federal government. And with lots of money, it's quite easy to convince state and local law enforcement organizations to either enforce or ignore certain laws with the enticement of federal funding. One of the most prominent examples was during the 70s when Nixon initiated the war on drugs.
As I talked to the people from New York State, I realized the need for money to deal with this problem. I am glad that in this administration we have increased the amount of money for handling the problem of dangerous drugs sevenfold. It will be $600 million this year. More money will be needed in the future. I want to say, however, that despite our budget problems, to the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts, because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
This was one of the first steps in the federalization of policing in the United States. There might be a few of you out there who actually believe it was a good idea for the federal government to involve itself in the area of law enforcement, given its vast resources. But the Constitution was designed not to centralize powers that deprive citizens of life, liberty, or property without due process. And the two primary ways to do this through government is through a military, which the Constitution prohibits as a result of the Third Amendment, and law enforcement via the 10th Amendment, which notes that power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, and the United States being the federal government, nor prohibited by it, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And the Constitution does not grant policing powers to the federal government, despite what they think. Now, you may be wondering why we wouldn't want to have a unified and centrally controlled law enforcement department throughout the United States. Well, that's because history and experience taught the framers that centrally controlling the power to arrest was contrary to individual liberty. And there are examples littered throughout history. Prior to the reign of Adolf Hitler and the rise of Nazi Germany, German law enforcement was, well, much like ours. It was decentralized and it rested in the hands of German states. And it wasn't until 1933, when Hitler and the Nazi regime came to power, that law enforcement became centralized, and its responsibilities went from maintaining law and order to political and racial enforcement. Thus was born the SS and the Gestapo.
In the elections of January 1933, the National Socialists won sufficient seats in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, for Hitler to be voted Chancellor, heading a coalition government. Goering became Minister of Prussia, the largest German state, and moved rapidly to bring its police force under his own direct control. Large numbers of fanatical Hitler supporters were drafted in to swell its ranks. Goering was soon able to mount a furious campaign against the opposition parties. Following a second election in March 1933, Goering used his police to arrest some deputies and to prevent others from entering the parliament building. Under these intimidating constraints, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. By this momentous and irrevocable transfer of power, the fragile German democracy was extinguished, and Hitler unable to rule by decree alone.
The Gestapo had virtually unfettered power and was tasked with the political enforcement and recruitment and or control of local law enforcement, arresting troublemakers, and they even threw in an assassination or two. Does this sound familiar? This is why we do not have and should never have a fully centralized police force. And all this leads me to the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. As I said in my most recent video about the attempted assassination of Trump, I'm sure you can find all the stats and all the data that has been collected thus far. It's all over the internet. So I'm not going to get into the weeds with the circumstances surrounding the attempt. But it appears, at least at the surface, that the FBI and the Secret Service were at least deliberately indifferent to the information they received regarding the shooter prior to the round being squeezed off. And given that both organizations have been less than transparent, well, in reality, they've been opaque with regard to their roles and responsibilities during the Trump rally, it begs the question, why? Do you remember when I told you at the beginning of this presentation that I was just a little bit off on my assessment of the need for an enema for federal law enforcement that I was a bit optimistic. I now believe that the rot within these organizations has permeated too deep, down to rank-and-file officers and agents within these organizations. I'm sure some of you have heard news stories that reveal FBI agent whistleblowers who claim the FBI is selectively targeting conservative agents and officers within the agency by either revoking or denying security clearances. Here, take a look.
The House's Weaponization of Federal Government Subcommittee released its report charging the FBI has politicized rot in the agency and leadership. The report was based on testimony from self-described FBI whistleblowers, 3 who appeared publicly in front of the committee. Some of the accusations in the whistleblower report accuse the FBI of inflating domestic violence extremism to fit a political narrative from the Biden administration and forcing out conservative employees. The day before the meeting, the FBI said it had revoked the security clearances of 3 agents, including 2 who were testifying at the hearing because of ties to January 6th.
We also have testimony from local law enforcement SWAT teams on the assassination attempt of Trump. They claim they relayed information about Crooks, the shooter, 2 hours prior to the assassination attempt and continued to provide information up to the time when Crooks began firing his rifle. The Secret Service claims they didn't receive the information from local law enforcement regarding the shooter. What's telling is local law enforcement claims that they did not even meet with the Secret Service detail prior to the shooting. Someone's lying, and my money is on the Secret Service and the FBI.
I remember standing in the parking lot and talking to one of the guys, and so we just became part of history, and not in a good way.
The SWAT team from Beaver County, Pennsylvania knew something about the scrawny young man seemed off. He can be seen in this video obtained by ABC affiliate WTAE skulking around former President Trump's rally. Text messages between local snipers show they noticed Thomas Matthew Crooks at 4:26 p.m., nearly 2 hours before the attempted assassination that would injure Trump, kill a man, and severely hurt 2 others. "You see me go out with my rifle," one of the snipers texted, "so he knows you guys are up there." By 5:14 p.m., they grew suspicious.
He was looking up and down the building and just wandering around, and it just seemed out of place.
Greg Nichols snapped these photos of the shooter.
We had a text group between the local snipers that were on scene. I had sent those pictures out to that group and advised them of what I noticed and what I'd seen.
What do you think is transpiring once you send in what you've sent in?
I assumed that there would be somebody coming out to, speak with this individual or, find out what's going on.
So how do you know if Greg's concerns about Crooks are being relayed properly?
We don't. We have to assume that when he put that information out to command, that command took that information and did something with it. We don't know if they did.
None of the concerns appears to have reached members of Trump's Secret Service detail. The Washington Post reports they've complained they were never made aware of the warnings. In their first public comments about the assassination attempt, members of the Beaver County SWAT team described to ABC News what they consider to be failures of planning and communication that would prove catastrophic.
We were supposed to get a face-to-face briefing with the Secret Service snipers whenever they arrived, and that never happened. So I think that was probably a pivotal point where I started thinking things were wrong, because that never happened, and we had no communication with the Secret Service.
You had no communication with the Secret Service at all on that Saturday?
No, not until after the shooting, I believe. Yeah.
And by then?
It was too late.
The Secret Service declined to respond directly, but told ABC News the agency is committed to better understanding what happened and is offering complete cooperation with ongoing investigations.
So, to clean up this mess, not only do we have to fire every single supervisor and manager within the federal law enforcement arm, but we're also going to have to vet rank-and-file agents and officers individually to ensure that each law enforcement organization within the federal government is free of political bias. Because unless we do this, we will never be confident that the federal law enforcement arm, and to a lesser extent state law enforcement, are only beholden to the Constitution and the welfare of all Americans. And this concludes today's presentation of Office of the Patriot. If you enjoy the content, please take the time to like, subscribe, and share my channel on your social media. It is appreciated. Further, please take the time to comment. Engagement is the major metric that social media platforms like YouTube and Rumble use to determine searchability in their algorithm. The more people that like, subscribe, and comment, the more likely the Office of the Patriot channel will come up when social and political topics like this are searched for. And as always, have a blessed day and stay safe out there.